On behalf of the National Library, I'd like to thank everybody for coming and welcome you here. It's a very significant day for the library. My own name is Mark Cranfield. I'm from the Oral History section of the library, and it'll be my very pleasant duty in a minute or two to introduce Peter Reid and Wendy Lowenstein. If I can just encourage, because I know this isn't easy, people who are sitting at the back to come a little bit closer. The best seats for this stuff really are at the front. If you stay glued to your seats, well, we'll understand, but there are better seats in the front. So they're highly recommended. And you can do that while I'm chatting and before Peter and Wendy really start to do their thing. While you're rearranging a little, I thought I should just say something about the format for the session. We really have to be out of here by about 10 to 4. So that would allow Peter 30 minutes approximately, Wendy 30 minutes approximately, and then if you can hold questions until the end, we could have a questions and discussion session through till about 10 to 4, and everyone perhaps will want to be in the foyer because the Director General then draws the raffle for the free trip to Queensland. The winner could be here. Okay, now to start, our first speaker will be Dr. Peter Reid. Peter is currently a visiting fellow in the Department of History at the ANU. He's a long-time resident of Canberra, and he's worked extensively as a collector, editor and teacher of oral history since 1977. Perhaps the central feature of Peter's work has been to document aspects of Aboriginal history and to engage Aboriginal people in the process. Quite frequently, his books have been subtitled, spoken, written and photographed by those who took part. Dr. Reid has a long list of scholarly publications, and they include 3 books of oral history. The first one, Down There With Me on the Curragh Mission, came out in 1984. The Lost Children came out in 1991, and Long Time, Olden Time, Aboriginal Accounts of Northern Territory History was published in print form in 1991, and Peter will be saying much more about that in a few moments. Peter has a long association with the library's oral history section. Field recordings for his biography of Charles Perkins are held here, as is the interview he recorded for the library's project with the eminent prehistorian Professor John Mulvaney. Earlier this year, because of his own outstanding record of achievement in Australian history, Peter himself was interviewed for the library's collection. His current research project, when I last spoke to him about it, was called Mental Maps. As the program notes explain, in that project, he's once again using oral history methods, this time to explore the way in which Australian people form and express their attachments to particular areas of country. We were anticipating that the field recordings he produces will be deposited with the library and that ultimately they too will become available for research. Now, if Peter Reid is the best known academically based oral historian in Australia, Wendy Lowenstein is certainly the best known name in the community at large. Wendy, for anyone who might not know it, is from Melbourne. Working from there, she's been active in the Australian labour movement for most of her life, which has included a childhood lived out in the Great Depression and teenage years lived during the Second World War. These were the days, I should think, when her radical perspective on our history was formed. Wendy has had an extremely active, varied and productive life. She's been a proofreader, a print journalist, a radio journalist, a factory worker, a full-time mother and a teacher librarian. She is without doubt one of the most distinguished collectors of folklore and oral history in Australia, with fieldwork and publications extending over more than 25 years. Her pioneering book, Weevils In The Flour, an oral record of the 1930s depression in Australia, is easily the best known and biggest selling work of its kind. Some of her other publications include The Immigrants, which came out in 1977, Under the Hook, A History of Melbourne Waterside Workers from 1900 through to 1980, published in 1982, and shocking, The Improper Play Rhymes of Australian Children, which she published in the 70s. Almost certainly, during the last decade, she would have received an award under the Australian Honours System for her creative output on behalf of the rank and file and grassroots Australia. Except for the fact that with typical frankness, she's made it quite plain that she doesn't want one. Wendy's association with the National Library is now in its second decade. The library's holdings of her work include field tapes made during a round Australia trip to collect folklore and social history in 1969-70, field recordings for both Weevils in the Flour and Under the Hook, as well as tapes recorded in 1991 with Ron Edwards, another key figure in the Australian folklore movement. She's currently working simultaneously on two more oral history projects, one on unemployment in the 1980s and 90s, the other on the influence of the left on the arts in Australia. It's therefore not difficult to see why Russell Ward, in his recent autobiography, would refer to her as that dynamo of energy, Wendy Lowenstein. The appearance of Peter and Wendy here today is, in the first place, an outcome of their long association with the National Library. In the second place, it's an indication of the high regard in which they are held throughout the country. When the program for today's celebrations was being drawn up, it was unanimously agreed that there could be no more appropriate guest speakers than Peter Reid and Wendy Lowenstein. It therefore gives me great pleasure to ask Dr. Peter Reid to open the proceedings this afternoon and tell us what oral history can't tell us.
Thank you, Mark. I've called my talk What Oral History Can't Tell Us, and I'll be, I hope, demonstrating during some of my talk what are some of the disadvantages with oral history as we currently know it. And then I'm going to spend some time towards the end, with the help of Marius Koemans from Firmware, demonstrating a form which I hope gets rid of some of the disadvantages of oral history. So the difficulty of transferring oral history interviews to a form which can be shared by other people, we've all been discussing, us oral historians, for years and years. It's a wider problem than how to turn voice into print, which is how we generally see the argument. I'm looking at it differently. That is, how does one turn what's essentially a personal and intimate and one-to-one communication to a form which is impersonal and public and one-to-many? Well, there's three different ways in which we do this. The book, of course, and the radio, and a transcription. I'm going to look at those three in reverse order, very briefly, looking at what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of those forms of rendering the original interview to a form which other people can understand. The first is the literal transcription. Generally, the original recording and the transcription are lodged together in an archive like the National Library's here. Good transcription, though, is highly skilled and very, very expensive. Unless one is engaged in interviewing former cabinet ministers, you're very unlikely to have your transcription provided by whoever commissions the interview. And even if you do get a transcription, like the original interview, that'll be locked away, or not locked away, but it'll be available in the archives for somebody who knows it's there. It'll probably have a very small audience, unless someone shapes it either into a radio broadcast or a book. Let's think of radio for a minute. Of course, you bypass transcription altogether there, if you can make it, say, to the oral history show of the ABC and the social history unit. You'd imagine that a good interview would make a good broadcast, but that's not always the case. Radio, it seems, abhors a silence, or radio producers abhor silences anyway, even though we all know silences can convey as much as words do. Pauses longer than a couple of seconds on the radio are liable to be shortened, whatever their emotional significance in the beginning. Sentences will vanish if you send your tape to the oral history unit of the ABC or other radio producers. Whole minutes of talk will be transposed in the producer's effort to make a good narrative, which has, I think, rather too long been regarded as the same thing as good oral history. Now, of course, some terrific works have been produced from broadcast oral histories, which we all know, like Time Belong Master, Prisoners of War. We could go on for a long time. And there's some produced outside, like The Lifeblood of Footscray by the Melbourne's Living Museum of the West, which have been produced for community access radio. But there's some disadvantages there. For one thing, a very small proportion of what's actually collected finds its way onto the radio. But more importantly, some speakers are considered to be too mannered to be allowed on the radio at all. I'd like you to listen to a tape recording I've made with a woman who was born in 1903, so she speaks like a 90-year-old, which she is. And she's talking about the opening of the Parliament House, the first Parliament, in 1927. She had a terrific memory and a most interesting tale to relate. And her words, when you see them written down on the transcript I've got here, require no editing. But bear in mind, this is a tape that never made the radio because it was considered a bit too strange in its speech mannerisms to use. Let's have a listen to it. Okay. Could you tell me about that Aboriginal man, the very old chap?
Oh yes, there was, I can't think of his name, but he was the oldest Aboriginal around Canberra at the time, and they dressed him up, and two police was guarding him, and they brought him to the first row of people at the ropes, and they put him beside where I was standing. So when the procession started, of course, people were saying, "Here comes the King and Queen," and he got under the ropes and had his hand out to shake hands to the King and Queen, and the police grabbed him, brought him back and put him there, and he waved and waved like everyone else, and I'd say about an hour afterwards, the Queen and her guard walked out and spoke to the police, and they brought them over to where I was standing and he was sitting, and she shook hands to him and presented him with a tin of biscuits, and he was excited to think that the missus, as he called her, gave him a present, and everyone around went talking to him, and he finished up breaking down and he cried like a child. But he had, I suppose, so much attention given to him.
You can probably see already why that tape wasn't considered suitable for radio. I can understand any radio producer thinking that was a bit slow. You probably found yourself reading the bottom of the story long before our speaker had got to it. I don't know, but it could be. You see, the pauses are so long that what radio producers conventionally do is chop out spaces between the words. You couldn't do that if there's a pause between every word, and it would become something quite different from the way it was delivered first. And yet, a transcription there looks terrific. There's only 4 ers there. You could take them out and you'd have a piece of model prose that requires no editing. Perfect grammar, all in neat little parentheses. You'd think that's somebody who really knows how to present the English language in a neat and concise form. But it never went to air. And we can see why, I think, why it didn't do. So not everybody is suitable to go on the air, even if they have a good oral history story to relate. So that tape probably is liable to remain undisturbed in the vaults of the National Library's Oral History Unit. Well, a third problem, which is unresolved in either broadcast or the printed text, is how to convey to a mass audience the deep emotion of an intimate interview. Some of the most moving interviews in the literature of oral history not unnaturally concern profound personal experience. A torpedoed ship, the brutality of a prison camp, the hunger and despair of the Great Depression. And in my own work, mainly in Aboriginal oral history, I've recorded stories of massacres and children being snatched by welfare officers and police torture and sexual abuse, not because I was actually looking for those kind of stories, but because people were choosing me as a medium by which the speaker could relate their story to a much wider audience. But you see, the consciousness that the speaker was talking to a wider audience didn't reduce the intense and sometimes agonised emotion by which the story was being told to me. And in so doing, of course, a relationship, as all oral historians know, is established between the interviewer and the subject, in which the interviewer assumes a role not unlike that of a good friend or even a counsellor. It's a relationship, even though it's a temporary one, it does raise all sorts of ethical responsibilities and questions which we can't go into here. What I'm really talking about here is how on earth are you going to convey not just the story, which oral history does well, but the emotions, that personal relationship by which the story was conveyed. And my belief is oral history doesn't do that at all well. Here's a recent example drawn from my current work of investigating the way in which non-Aboriginal Australians form and talk about their attachments to particular places. It's a story of Cribbs Island, which is a little village on the edge of Moreton Bay, which was destroyed in the 70s to make way for an extension of Brisbane Airport. The woman in question, whom I was interviewing, she'd lived in the area for practically all her life, in a house which her husband had built, and in 1973 they received orders, you've got to shift out. Within a year of receiving notice of eviction, the family had, under great duress, sold their house and moved into a nearby suburb. Well, I want to illustrate here some different editing techniques of how you could put this onto the printed page and how, really, none of them finally work, in my opinion. Here's the first one, in which the emotion isn't too strong, but it's going to get stronger as time goes on as she talks about more immediate feelings for the house that she had.
So we were lucky we were on 2 deeds.
Yes, also. How do the kids take it, do you think?
Well, my second daughter, Patricia, has never forgiven anybody for it. She said, I cannot take my children to see where I used to live, where I grew up, where I was born, and I cannot take my kids to show them where I went to school. She's very bitter about it, the whole thing. She's really a motherly mother, if you get what I mean. She likes a family-orientated child. She's 30-odd. But she's, the other children aren't as bitter about it as what Patricia is. Mm. She really, whenever she talks about it, she says, I can't take my kids to see where I went to school. She said, that really hurts.
You can see I think there's something in that last phrase, that really hurts. There's a building up of emotion there which really isn't possible to render on the page. What could we do? Give it an exclamation mark? That'd be a miscue, because it's not as if she says it loudly or angrily. It's something more internal than that. We can see why she's building up to a strong emotion there, I think, in that really hurts, when we can see what follows it, which is a story of how she came around the corner to find her own house being destroyed. I've got two versions of this, one which has all the exclamations and words which start and stop all left out, and it's a straight piece of prose and looks like an ordinary paragraph. We'll hear that now, and then I'll try it again using a different kind of editing technique. People say that of me too. Mm. Mm.
This elderly couple I was talking about earlier, I used to do their washing and ironing and their grocery shopping and things like that. It got a bit difficult once we had to shift, but I dropped off their groceries and I came around and I went past my house and I saw it being pulled down, and I just stopped the car and I burst into tears. I just seeing them pulling it to pieces was just something that you'd strived, and John worked very hard to get for us, just to be pulled to pieces. It was just terrible.
I think, in a way, this is what oral history does well, in the sense of giving a story, there's a person who was affected by the destruction of her house. What we've lost, though, is something really personal, which I was exchanging with the speaker at that moment. Now, it's been flattened out. If we look at this version, you can see at once it looks very different. There's the I, which she first said, which I cut out. I think she says down here, that was just, well, it wasn't there before. And there's an extra sentence down the bottom by which she was telling me, letting me know, or perhaps letting herself know, that there was an emotional closure there. She was saying, that's the end of that particular topic, I want to talk about something less emotionally draining now. So I've used a larger space here than a one paragraph space and a two paragraph space there. But what's the point? In a way, you mightn't even notice that there is a larger gap there. And what if there was a longer gap as well? Do you have a new page now, or what? But let's listen to it again and see if you think this is an improvement. Just that last part, thank you.
That's what people say out of enemy too.
This elderly couple I was talking about earlier, I used to do their washing and ironing and their grocery shopping and things like that. It got a bit difficult once we had to shift. But I dropped off their groceries and I came around and I went past my house and I saw it being pulled down. And I just stopped the car and I burst into tears. I just seeing them pulling it to pieces was just something that you'd strived, and John worked very hard to get for us, just to be pulled to pieces. It was just terrible. And I know other people felt the same way.
Well, now, in that second passage, we've got all sorts of intractable problems about how to edit that. First, how are we going to reveal the change in pace and intensity between the first and the second passage? An edit should arguably try to punctuate that last phrase to convey the intensity of the whispered, agonised, just terrible, followed by that firmer emotional closure, by which the speaker was telling the interviewer that she decided to say no more. Without hearing the sound of the voice, readers might think that the version 1 is powerful enough in its own right. In one sense, they'd be right. It's obvious that at least one person felt deep emotion at the destruction. But version 2, that second one I had there, you might think that's a bit over-dramatic. It looks a bit affected. This is the problem. I think oral history fails us in both versions when we look at it to read in a book. An emotion of grief and loss has been conveyed, but not the particular form of grief and loss experienced by a particular speaker. Oral history does convey the former well, and that's what we historians and others, readers and listeners, expect of it. But it fails to carry the particular intensity of a moment of interview because of that gulf between the one-to-one communication and the one-to-many. So now what I'd like to do is consider the CD-ROM form. If you can imagine, you'd have not a big screen here, you'd have a little screen in front of you, your own personal computer and your own mouse, the cursor control. So it's a much more intimate form, in fact, than what we've got here. You might think some of what I've been talking about before aren't very important. They're rather very subtle kind of differences. But I think here, in what I hope to be demonstrating in this Aboriginal oral history, which J. Reid, my wife and I, shows down the front here, produced together a couple of years ago, and Marius Koemans here, Director of Firmware, put onto a CD-ROM form for us. I hope to demonstrate that apart from the electronic whiz-bangery, we can see
no white people been here.
How immediate the text can be.
Nothing. And it never be that way. On Emmonsburg, that's all. Two. Allegedly. Two. My father, seven premier, I'm in trouble now. Right up Emmonsburg. I will get him blanket, clothes, butt knife, and eggs. There. Let me go back. I think I gotta go back in family, country. You know, older people a long time ago, time been walking around everywhere. Everywhere. Not television, not like white people, you know that. Never, not allowed coming through paint, not a bleed, you know, white people. No jealous for country. Now, older people, time been walking around, not go back to another place. Prayer. It's prayer. You know why? No paint, no jealous business for country. Now, prayer.
That's the introduction to the book, or the CD-ROM I should call it. Again, please bear in mind that it's not designed to be looked at on a big screen like this. It's designed to be your own personal relationship with that. As we have designed the book with Marius's help, it's got an index in the conventional way and about 150 Aboriginal people telling stories of the different parts of the Northern Territory experience which they've had. So we can move on to the index now. Here we are, it's coming up. And you can see there how we've organised it there. There's a map there which Marius has got his finger on. Let's go to the map and we'll choose one of the stories out of there, or two actually. We'll choose one from Milingimbi first of all. There's our map. A larger map will shortly appear on the right-hand side. There it is. You can see Milingimbi top right. We can find it. Of course, you can find it under the author as well. This is just electronic gadgetry, just to save time, really. But there's a number of stories from Milingimbi using the fine facility, and we'll go to the one in which 1927 rather, and some Methodist missionaries are about to be attacked on Milingimbi. Rhoda Roberts, the North Coast Koori, has kindly consented to do the link passages for us. There's Mr. Wallaleepa, who's going to tell the story. And you can see there the press accounts of the original story are there for the reader to look at as well. Okay, could we go to the next one? Yeah, we'll start at the bottom paragraph there, at the time of the attack, just to give you an idea, and then Mr. Wallaleepa immediately launches in with the story, and we'll just have a couple of minutes of it to give you the idea of what it can sound like.
At the time of the attack on the missionaries in 1927, Willie Wallaleepa was a missionary assistant and an eyewitness to these events. He began the story at a point where Robertson sent two men to the Aboriginal camp with instructions to find out how many promise wives, that is, traditional marriages arranged at birth, each of the men had. They returned with the news that Robertson would have to go and find out for himself.
All right. It's true they go down and talk to Mr. Robertson, you know. We couldn't tell you now, Mr. Robertson. I think you go down yourself. Too many up there now. Lot of wife for one man. A lot of everything the culture, but you all know people that promise. Good to tell you, but you go and listen to yourself. All right, Mr. Robertson, go down now, come there, start now, you ask him now. You got pipe there, you got a whip, a little bit of whip there. Something. Make a fraud by the people, you know, carrying that whip. Mr. Robertson, only a policeman at that line missionary. All right. Come and ask him start from there, Christian, for the people. You know, look here, boy, we got the idea now, but that's mission come here, Milingimbi. Once you got to be carried out the law now by the Yolma people, break the law. We don't like you got married by the two double wife here with a child. That's Milingimbi house. All your Aboriginal, you cut it out. Break them down to your culture. You want to use one in the Bible, law, one wife, and children. Now, some of your people are bringing a little bit of knowledge. We got a good mouth of talking about a little bit of English. We're talking about Mr. Robertson. You know, Mr. Robertson, you come here with too many humbug for the child. You break him down how culture, but the Yolma people, Aboriginal people, we use him that why we married wrong culture from our idea from our law, but the Aboriginal people. Without this law, that is your European law. Go away, Mr. Robertson. We don't want you to come and talk to me anymore, Christianize to me about it. You talk to me, no, you got no right to talk older than my wife. How many wives? We got 5, 6? That man, that's my business. Now look here, I gotta give you a whip. Look here, boy, sometimes you call a name. If you don't let that woman there get married by another man, what about the young people here even married? You shut up, go away. You got no business got to say. All right, Mr. Everybody go down now for another camp. You walk around and come and see how many wives you got there. You ask him, Christian.
Okay, we might cut
How
off
many
the
wives
fence
you
here.
got there?
Sorry, we'll have to break into the story there. Suffice it to say that missionaries were in due course attacked, and with a rather severe rap on the knuckles eventually by the presiding judge for the missionaries. Anyway, it's easy to get carried away by the sort of whiz-bang technology here, which is not my intention. My intention was, you'll recall, to try and demonstrate how this particular form can return that intimacy which we lose either on the radio, I think, or in the printed page. And that wasn't a particularly intimate story, the one we just listened to, because Mr. Wallaleepa was really addressing untold thousands throughout Australia, and he hardly looked at me at all. So there wasn't much to bring back of my particular exchange. But this was a different story here. This is a lady called Hagar Roberts, and the story is a familiar one. An Aboriginal woman removed from her family in the 1920s was placed in the Roper River Anglican Mission at the age of 2 or 3. She grew up seeing her parents once a year at Christmas. She valued Christian stories above all else because, she said, she was taught to know about a white God story, teaching us what to do long a white man way. That story. They didn't let us go to mothers and fathers. Now, over many years, this full descent Alawar woman ceased to speak her language at all. And one of the most affecting parts of a very memorable interview to me was her attempts to recall her native tongue, which had been taught to discard so many years before. On the tape now, as you'll hear, her voice is almost inaudible. The pauses are excruciating. And the story, I've chosen this one deliberately because it's so anticlimactic. It looks so inconsequential. There are no strong narrative, no climax, nothing of the strong narrative line we've come to expect from oral history programs generally. On the CD-ROM, of course, all the pauses and the almost inaudible searching of the mind for words so long forgotten are reproduced without editing. Thoughts half begun fade to silence. This extract, I think, would be rejected both for a broadcast and a book as being about nothing. I think the CD-ROM, imagine again, you've got a screen in front of you, helps to reinforce this particularly poignant moment for me. The printed transcription, if you read it without the soundtrack, is almost a translation from a foreign language. The soundtrack alone is hard to understand. The CD-ROM, I believe, comes closest to apprehending that poignant moment in which the tragedy of a personal history and the tragedy of a people's history were one. I'm going to finish at this point after the broadcast on this anticlimactic note deliberately, because I think this is where the real strength of oral history can lie. So here's Hagar Roberts taking us out.
They must have missed seeing their children. When they sat down by the campfire at night, they said, "Oh, where's our children?" They back at Roper. They must have been sad.
Yeah, they've always been sad, but they never been sad much, you see. They was forgive because they were known we should have been care of. Look after very well. And the Christmas, every Christmas, they was come and visit us and go away again. Come and speak us, got our own language, but we never been know much, you see. Tell us to go everything like this, got the language. We used to ask mother and father, what you say something. We tell you to go pick that tin same as I tell you, that billy can, and the well, and the fish, I don't know much.
They'd tell you something in Alloa, and you'd say, "Hey, what do you mean, Daddy?
Yeah.
What do you mean?"
Yeah, that's what we usually say. Is asking, let we know, you see. But we never been pick up all that language much.
when you were little, did you want to go and see your mother and father?
I never been thinking for my mother and father because I was had very nice teacher for us to look after and care of.
Did you call the missionary, Mummy and Daddy?
Yeah, we usually do that. They're usually nursing us. But they call this crow from the salons. Let me think for that. They call something. I can. They call emu, they call it Judy. Yeah, that's from Allah. The kangaroo, they call it Kirimbu. And the Jitbilili, that plain kangaroos, the antler plain, the great big ones. They call it them. Just think for that. They usually call it them. And that Gwen, I told you for that. And the snake, they call it Yangan. That snake, Yangan.
Good. Thanks very much.
Peter, thank you very much. There was some fascinating material there, and I'm sure there'll be questions to ask about this. I should say that another important reason for this getting together today is that Peter Reid and Wendy Lowenstein have never met. You have met. They've met rarely. But you don't often see them together, let me put it that way. So it's a great opportunity to ask them questions, and what I'm really concerned with is to give you the maximum chance to do that. So without asking some of the questions which I was busily jotting down there in the dark, I'll hand over now to Wendy Lowenstein, that human dynamo.
I didn't read that in Russell's book. Oh, shit. Excuse me. Right? Yes, it was a step. Good. I'll just check them out. Okay. Yep. Well, that was the most fascinating presentation of Peter Reid's, and of course that every oral historian agonises over how they can best present the material on their tapes in the most honest and without doing violence to either their duties to the informant or their duties to the public or their duties to truth, whatever truth may be. And I thought it was very fascinating. I, of course, write books. I'm a writer by profession, and the way I try to present the tapes is by not doing the things that a lot of other people have done with oral history, not doing the things that Cecil Sharp did perhaps with folk songs, but using only the words of the informants, not all of them by any means, but adding none of my own, except perhaps the occasional preposition, pronoun, etc. And in fact, I have been working towards the sort of presentation that Peter showed you, the second one, of trying to make spaces and dots and somehow arrange the stuff on the printed page so it does respond more to reality. The trouble is that publishers want to push up all your words together to take up less space. They don't they're not in love with the large, wide space, and this is a problem. Now, I just like to say that I was delighted to be here today. The National Library is 25 years old, and it's almost exactly 25 years ago that I first went into the field with my tape recorder. And I think if it was not for institutions like the National Library, I would have long since dropped out of the field. And so thank you very much for asking me. I was both surprised and delighted and flattered. I'd like to say that in the years I've been collecting in the field on very marginal resources, I've been sustained in my work and encouraged and given lots of rope with which I hope not to hang myself by John Thompson, who was a manuscript librarian at the La Trobe Library and later here, and who in his wisdom and lack of male chauvinist patronage of elderly ladies who other people had been patronising for years, has endeared himself to me very much and has helped me to have confidence in myself. And Mark Cranfield, of course, who was working under John when he first came here, has enjoyed that freedom, and he has taken it very much further forward, so that now this is one of the great oral history repositories of the world. And I think that is very much to their credit. Interestingly enough, I discovered yesterday that Kevin Bradley, who heads the preservation unit, practically is the preservation unit, he and Shelley, is now recognised as a world leader in preservation techniques and in advance of the two former world leaders, both the Library of Congress and the Austrian Oral Archives. So we have really all the expertise here that this great archives deserves. And of course I would have never gone into the field, and if I had, I would have thrown away most of my tapes because I was only looking for folklore, had not Edgar Waters prevented me with his wise advice and kindness and friendship. And whenever I've had the sense to consult him about what I should do in the field, I've found it very fruitful. Now, the really fascinating thing and the good thing about this collection is that it is one of the few large repositories in the world which emphasises the primacy of the tape. Many other large repositories, oral history repositories, in fact, throw out the tape after they've written the transcript, which in my opinion is a terrible tragedy. And as you could just see from what you've just seen, how much what it lent, how much would have been lost. David Foster wrote a book, who's edited a book called Self-Portraits, which was published by the National Library from material from the De Burgh collection, put this very well. And he said that he'd read the transcripts first, and they spoke to him more or less with one voice. But when he listened to the tapes, they spoke to him with 15 different voices. And he said a living voice is a landscape in which the transcript in print, is but the merest map. And I think you saw that a minute ago. He also added, I rather like this, it was not only what God said to Moses, it was the tone of voice that he uses to say what he says that guarantees obedience. And as a school teacher, I've used the same technique, I must say. Oral history, of course, is not new, and it's rather good that I don't have to keep now saying what I have been saying for years, when no one else but me knew what I was talking about, that have to keep pointing out that oral history is the voice of the people and that it is worth preserving and that it is important to preserve it. But people do tend to think it's new. Now, it's not new. Of course, it's older than any other sort of history, because all pre-literate people, for the greater part of history, the historical of humanity on this earth, have been handing down not only history but all knowledge, all culture, by mouth, or by example. And usually, very often, the word was part of the song, was part of the dance, was part of the whole culture which reinforced the passing on of this knowledge. And to think that it is new, and to ask, is it true, is no longer quite fashionable in progressive historical circles. And even quite apart from pre-literate people, although the printed sources have taken over largely as the respected source for historians, who mustn't forget historians like the great Chinese historian, who I think it was in the Ming dynasty, Sima Qian, used to hover around in the marketplaces and listening to the common people, jotting down what they were saying for his great history. He was a very devoted historian. Rather than give up his history when attacked by authorities, he actually chose to allow them to castrate him. And as long as they let him get on with their history, he wouldn't give up. And I think that was quite a remarkable thing. Then, of course, as well as people like Sima Qian, there was Henry Mayhew, who wrote about the London poor, the rag pickers and the scavengers, and wrote great long pieces in his book where he transcribed from their speech. And getting a bit closer to the past, there was Hubert Howe Bancroft, who was an American oral historian, again a journalist, who had teams of people taking down with shorthand his interviews with people. He even recorded memories of the Sydney Ducks. That was the people from the goldfields who went to America, to Californian gold rushes, and were considered to be real tough cookies, even in a real tough place like the Californian goldfields. The Sydney Ducks were the bad boys of and our reputation was very low on the Californian goldfields. Well, Bancroft records this stuff. And then in 1930, there was a very pioneering program of interviewing living slaves, which was done under the New Deal in America, where they paid people to go out with who shorthand and take down the memories of the slaves, in 100 or so who were still living in shorthand. Now, I write working class oral history, and I think that Bertolt Brecht's great poem, A Worker's Questions While Reading, says it why I do it, says why it should be done much more succinctly than I can. Who built Thebes of the Seven Gates? In the books stand the names of kings. Did they then drag up the rock slabs? And Babylon, so often destroyed, who kept rebuilding it? Where did the bricklayers go the night the Great Wall of China was finished? Great Rome is full of triumphal arches. Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Philip of Spain wept when his fleet went down. Did no one weep besides? Caesar beat the Gauls without even a cook. The young Alexander conquered India. He alone? A victory on every page. Who cooked the victory feast? A great man every 10 years. Who paid the costs? So many reports, so many questions. Now, what I find very exciting about the practice of oral history is that it opens up a whole new history-conscious public amongst people who don't usually read or buy history books. When I wrote, with Tom Hills, who helped me get Wharfies to talk to me because they couldn't otherwise, wrote this book. I wanted to try, couldn't get it published because publishers said Wharfies don't read books. And so I went to the Waterside Workers Union and said, publishers say Waterside Workers don't read books. And they said, well, they don't either. And in fact, we couldn't get any support except from the Australian Society of Labour History here in Canberra to publish it. And so I published it myself. And what I found, and you see, this whole thing opens up not only a new history-conscious public, but it enables working people who are not academic or professional historians, to write about working class experience, a subject on which someone who's worked all their life on the wharf or in a clothing factory is like to be much better educated than some educated historians. And I think that this has been a real breakthrough. And in England, it's happened more than here, that working class people are writing the history of their working lives and transforming their own perceptions of themselves and their importance in society. And if it's written like that, working people will read it. It's quite an elitist assumption that workers won't read history. Offer them history relevant to their lives and they'll read it avidly. And I believe that the book Under the Hook, which is my least known book because I published it myself and it didn't get sort of pushed like commercial books do, is in fact my far most important book and will be, I hope, the one, if I am remembered, by which I am remembered, because it does what I don't think anyone else has done. It writes about rank and file workers, their working lives, their attitudes to their union, to their boss, to each other, and at a period, in 1980 it was published, when that whole working life and that whole industry was about to virtually vanish. Waterside ports can now be run by 2 men with a computer, instead of at the period of 7,000 men we had on the waterfront in Melbourne at the height of its time. Now, I think quite often people, perhaps not so much as they did, but people, historians who don't care for oral history or think it's sus, sort of tend to say, oppose oral history to written history. Now, this is not what I do, and I don't think very many oral historians do this either. And I'll just tell you, I'd like to tell you a couple of oral history incidents in my own family which demonstrate this. Now, I was on the 1978, I was on the island of Tanna in Vanuatu, and I said to the taxi driver from the airport, I said, my uncle lived on Tanna, and he said, what was he doing here? I said, he came to build a church. Oh, he said, Mr. Robertson. And so I said, well, look, he left here in 1932, and you'd only be about 30. How do you know? He said, well, I don't know him, he said, but I know all about him. And he said, my grandfather knew him, and my grandfather knew him, and my sons know about him, because we hand down our history. And he took me to the church where my uncle had not built, of course. We'd said in how Uncle had gone to build the church, he'd gone there to supervise the building. It was built by black Vanuatans. And he unearthed an old man who'd been there at the building, and they told me about how Uncle Ern had stayed down on the ground, and when a beam had to be sent up for the roof, the main beam for the roof, he'd eye it off with his eye, cut it to length, send it up, and it would fit, which I thought was pretty good. And then they said to me, how are your cousins? And I said, they said, well, yes, Mr. Robertson, he had a wife and her name was Mary, and they had 3 daughters, Mary and Nancy and Kathleen, you see. And so I said, I thought, as far as I knew, not having seen them for 20 or 30 years, that they worked quite well. And at least they were alive. So then they took me to my uncle's trading post, which was on the other side of the island, quite a long way from the port. And it was a little bunkhouse built of reinforced concrete. Now, this had been built about 1920. So I said, how did they get the cement here to build that? And they said, he said, the young man, he said, politely and carefully, it was a very careful conversation, carefully he said, the people carried it on their backs. Ah, I said, and I said, did you get paid? And he said, yes, we got paid. They got paid. And I said, how much? And he said, 5 cents. And I said, an hour. And he said, a month. And then I said, well, what did you do it for? And he said, well, Mr. Robertson was with them, with the missionaries. You see, so that was an interesting piece of oral history. Now, we've got another bit which proves that written sources are necessary too very often, because my grandfather, oral tradition says my grandfather was sacked from the Victorian Public Service on Black Wednesday 1878 when the Catholic Premier, Sir Graham Berry, sacked all, they said, the the senior Protestant public servants, because he was a Catholic, and the upper house and got his support from the Catholics, and the upper house led by Sir James McCulloch, who's no doubt a Presbyterian, refused supply. And so he sacked all the Presbyterian public servants. Now, my grandfather had been the superintendent of the Jaika Boys Reformatory at Pentridge, a frightful place. And there had been a riot against cruelty which broke out later in 1878. So I looked at the dates and said, oh, well, thank goodness he couldn't have been involved. He'd been sacked in January, and this was in March. Then I looked in the family Bible and discovered my uncle was born inside Pentridge in November. So we went to the papers and we discovered that my grandfather, as the superintendent, gave evidence at the inquiry, and he said that the riot had broken out without the boys alleging sadism against one of the warders. And he said, and I personally whipped him, and he refused to recant. And so we had him, he was then flogged, no doubt by the prison flagellator, until he recanted and said he'd been telling lies. And then they closed down this place, which was a place of savage punishment, shifted it to Ballarat, and I think probably my grandfather either was sacked or became redundant in the modern word, or left then. But you see, it had been a convenient fiction in the family to pass down that he'd left because he'd been victimised for being a Protestant. So you see, oral history is not good on dates quite often, but it's very good on experience. And I think it's great thing. You see, there's... I today, as Mark told you, am researching a book about unemployment. And no reliance on documents or statistics can ever reveal the state of shock and the destruction of self-respect, confidence and personality which is taking place on a massive scale amongst discarded working people in Australia today. White-collar, blue-collar, graduates, non-graduates, immigrants, young and old. Nothing can describe this creeping paralysis that isolates active people, makes them afraid to go out into the streets, afraid to go to the CES because they say a blank-eyed 18-year-old will look at them and say, well, at your age, why do you bother? But they have to go because they have to go or they don't get the dole, you see. And I just realised too how more valuable it is to be doing oral history while the great event is happening than to do it 40 years later, because very little of this comes into Weevils in the Flour. You see, what you get in Weevils in the Flour is the triumph and the survivors. And, well, we survived. But what you're getting now is the raw experience of human experience and self-doubt. And it really is quite frightening. Henry Reynolds said here yesterday, Professor Reynolds spoke of the Aborigines who'd been dispossessed, denigrated, used, despised, and where possible incarcerated. Well, this sort of thing, in my belief, I think, is happening to 1 million Australians today. An underclass is being created which are being robbed of their own self-esteem and told they're no good by blank-eyed 18-year-olds. And I think that this is I didn't want to do this oral history. I decided to give up oral history because it's too much work. And I rather fancied writing a feminist detective story. But somebody offered me her in advance, and I couldn't resist it. And now I, of course, am absolutely entranced. And this tapes eventually, I hope, will go into the National Library if my informants will allow it, because I believe that the informant and their rights are the prime rights, and that I don't have the right to do anything with their tapes that they don't want me to, or that would reflect on them. There's an enormous ethical question, as Peter Reid was saying. Now, I think I've lost a page. I don't know how I always do it. I said the National Library. I have lost a page. I've put it under something. Hang on. You'll excuse me while I just hunt about. Yes, there it is. I've turned it over in the wrong one. I wanted to talk a little bit about my book on the waterside workers, because it's very interesting to me. Someone said something when I was writing this. I remember we were sitting with a group of us in the canteen at the Union, I think, and they were talking about the relations between bosses being waterside worker employers, ship owners and wharfies, and so they were saying, I don't know, they used to provoke strikes that they didn't have to. He said they wouldn't talk to us. He said they used to do things with, could only lose them millions of bloody dollars, in lost work. He said, I could never work out why they did it. And some old bloke said, they hate us, that's why. And I thought, well, that's a bit over the top, hate us. And then somebody said, yeah, and it's not only they hate us, he said, the trouble is they need us, and that makes us hate us more. Now, I have come to the conclusion in the last 6 months that a great deal of the destruction of the Australian working class is going on just for that reason, because they hate us and they need us, and they've seen the opportunity to get rid of us and replace us with unskilled and low-paid labour and computers, and that's what they're doing. So anyway, I'd like to read you a little bit of this Under the Hook, and it was a couple of things I thought were memorable. One man said, I remember, just after I started on the wharf, an old fella dropped dead in the hold. We were standing around waiting for the ambulance, and an old wharfie was looking down at the bloke that was dead. And he looked up at the supervisor and he said, you did that, you killed him. And the supervisor said, what? What do you mean? I killed him? It was nothing to do with me. And this old fella said, yes, you did. You and the ship owners, you've been driving men for years. Now, that's the sort of thing that you're never going to find written down, but it encapsulates the attitudes of the wharf, on the wharf, and I think is very important. The other one was my friend Tom Hills, who's turns 90 next year and is still running the Retired Waterside Workers Association and half a dozen other important jobs, and is as bright as a button. He said the ship owners started off as pirates and they never changed. By the way, Tom left school when he was 10 and he's never been back since. You would call him possibly not very literate, but his oral literature is magnificent. The ship owners started off as pirates and they never changed. They got rich on colonialism. They transported the missionaries and the guns came later. They made their fortunes in India and China and Africa. They were in the slave trade. They paid their seamen bloody nothing and they shanghaied them from the waterfront pubs. In most of the world, they could get their ships loaded for almost nothing. Some places they still can. You waited on them for work. They picked you up when they wanted you and they sacked you the minute it was raining so hard it would damage the cargo. Never mind you. They only wanted you if you were strong and docile. If you got old or sick, they didn't pick you up. If you were militant, they didn't pick you up. They gave you nothing. The Federation under Healy took them on. We took on the bigger monopolies. And I think that's a very fine thing. Now, I was said before that the National Library is a great repository. And the reason it's such a great repository is that it gives freedom to people like me, and it collects social history, it collects oral history, and preserves them, it collects a great deal, variety of folklore. And it also now commissions professional interviewers to interview famous people. Now, these tapes are preserved, catalogued and transcribed, but shortage of funds and staff has resulted in a great backlog of social history and folklore material, which is not yet preserved or processed, and so not readily accessible. So someone who's writing a history of the Communist Party at the moment, his bibliography person contacted me and said, you don't have any tapes of communists in the National Library. I said, I must have 100. And she said, well, we couldn't find them. Now, it's at this rate of progress, it's unlikely that I will live to see my own collections in the National Library even catalogued, much less preserved, and now they're 25 years old. Only the well-informed know they're here. And, of course, it's not the National Library's fault. The National Library, like many other great institutions all over the world today, is being starved of funds. And but how support for independent field collectors and funds to allow this backlog to be reduced and to make the social history collections, not just mine, accessible to the public are an urgent need. The National Library isn't a grant-giving body, of course, and its resources are stretched to the limit, so what can be done? I think that there was one very good project the National Library did a few years ago, in that they employed, well, I don't know, the library did it, funding was found for a project on the cultural context of unemployment. And in, I think, most states of Australia, unemployed people were trained on all aspects of oral history, transcribing, recording, interviewing, everything except cataloguing and preserving. And this enabled them, and it was a great thing for the library. Now, it seems to me that at this time, when so many people have the time but not the means, when so many people are being paid to do nothing, who want to do something, it would be inspiring to see our government initiate something like the Roosevelt's New Deal of the 30s, where among many other initiatives, the unemployed people during the hungry 30s worked under the Works Project Administration, and who paid many unemployed artists, writers, field workers in folklore, oral historians, playwrights, songwriters, you know, name them. Woody Guthrie was paid to go down to, the Tennessee Valley Dam and write songs about it. Photographers, many others, they were paid this modest wage to go and do a great variety of artistic work. And many of these works are today's treasures, the pride of the libraries and art galleries of America. Now, would such a visionary plan, exciting plan, cost Australia any more than paying, policing and administering unemployment benefits to people to do nothing but to rust away, to offer training courses for non-existent jobs, as is happening today? Would it not be better to offer, not compel, but to offer interested out-of-work people a modest wage and the opportunities to contribute in all these ways to Australia's future? Think of the human value of such a scheme. Think of the dividends right now and in the future. And think of getting rid of all those backlogs for collectors all over Australia, for collections all over Australia. Every museum and gallery in Australia has got stuff that needs something done to it. I believe that this we could, perhaps in 20 years when someone interviews people about this depression, it would be, I would like to hope that they wouldn't say be like the people I interviewed about the last depression, who say we spent years on the dole being paid to chip weeds and do busy work. We could have been doing something for Australia. I think that would be a great plan. And Mark, if it ever happens, I don't want my tapes catalogued out of my turn. I just want them catalogued. Thank you very much.
Now, we do have a few minutes for questions. It's 20 minutes or so to 4, and we can go on until about 10 to 4. Greg Borshman, first question.
Wendy, Peter Reid spoke about building an intimacy with the person that you were talking to. As a woman, how did you find that, talking to Weevils who were under the hook?
Well, in Weevils in particular, I was asking them one day, do you want me to go over there or can you hear me? I was asking them one day about how they got stuff off the wharf. I'm not talking about legally, I'm talking about illegally. And one of them said to...
Let's get you on tape.
I'm sorry, yeah, no. I was talking to wharfies this day about getting stuff off the wharf illegally, and one of them looked at Tom and said, "Hey, who is this bitch, Tom?" And he said, "Wendy, I've told you, for God's sake, don't ask questions like that." And I said, "I'm going to ask questions like that because I want to know." And he said, "I suppose you'll have to trust her. She's stupid, but she's all right." But basically it was because of Tom, yes. But normally I find if you listen to people long enough, and I'm not an economical oral historian because I let things go on. You know, I'm usually inclined to let people tell me what they want first and then go back and ask them the questions they haven't covered. And I find that just by... you have to establish a dialogue. And there's only been one or two people I couldn't establish a dialogue with, and they were Bushmen up in the north who misunderstood why I was there. and and misunderstood my purpose, and I had to live rather happily. But no, I don't think I've ever found somebody I couldn't relate to in some meaningful way, not perhaps the way I wanted to. It's just a question of empathy, I suppose.
The question, just for the tape, was how do you establish intimacy? Next question. Diana Geezy. Yeah, to Peter Reid and Marius, how will further developments affect oral history, technological developments? Marius, you want to come up front?
I guess the short answer is I don't know. I think what's important is for us to experiment. And what's also important is for the creative people, the historians and the creative people, to get involved in technology, not to look at technology as something that's foreign, but to embrace it enthusiastically. What's wrong with technology most often is that technologists are in charge of it. When we put the creative people in charge of it, when we really use the technology, we'll find some new stuff, something that might actually be worth doing. As far as, I could make long predictions about full motion video and great sound quality and lovely low-cost players that everyone would have, but all those things are only going to come to fruition when we adopt it and try and do something really useful with it. If you'd like to add something.
One of the ideas which we had for this book, which we didn't do finally, was to run the original tape down the bottom of the screen in its absolutely unedited form, and so that if you're using this tape for school kids, they could see the different kind of editing techniques that'd be there. You could develop the editing styles a bit too. I suppose eventually when we get voice to CD direct transfer, which I'm told isn't all that far away, instant recognition of words, and then we'll be moving into a direction we haven't moved yet. It's important not to keep the technology for what it is. I always think of the person who kept on building improvements into his harpsichord and finished up with a piano. It's important to think this isn't a video. If we keep on adding moving images to it, we'll finish up with a video or a movie, and that's already been invented. There's no point in doing that. I believe that, so Robin Bancroft, who's in the audience, was telling me the encyclopedia produced by the Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies will have opportunities for people to record and transcribe some of that work on the left-hand side of the screen. Is that right, Rob? Yeah. And that's one, we haven't used anything like that here, but that's obviously a new way to go. I think Marius is right, basically. We need the technical expertise, but we need the poets to really think through how can we really get the poetry out of this. Forget about the whiz-bang technology. Let's get some poetry into this and really start using it the way it could be used, I think.
I had a question myself for Wendy Lowenstein before we go to the next one. It was interesting to me, Wendy, that you mentioned Under the Hook as the book that you want to be remembered for. Now, you self-published that, or with the assistance of the Waterside Workers, and I'm just wondering, are there copies available? If people want to get a copy, how do they go about it?
Oh, you don't mean the tape for this, do you? Well, I couldn't carry... There are copies, yes. I published it, and I have a copy here if anyone wants to look at it. Unfortunately, I actually bought it in case anyone wanted to buy it, and then I discovered it was a copy that I'd got all the old wharfies to sign, so I can't. If anyone wants to look at it, I can arrange to have copies in Canberra within a very few days. In fact, one of the things I like about it was I was able to do, because I published it, put a lot of photographs and that sort of thing into it, which my publishers weren't willing to put in. But yes, I do have it.
So still available. The man in the red shirt.
Wendy Lowenstein. Your cataloguing of the current recession and people's very personal feelings in those circumstances. Very interesting, opposite end of the numbers spectrum, the sort of thing Hugh Mackay does with his reinventing
Who? I didn't catch the name. Oh, yes.
In Reinventing Australia writes about this, but he conceals the individual but tries to bring out the generalisation. Are you comfortable that you and he are telling the same story, or are bringing out the same story?
I didn't know he was. I'm not a radio listener. I'm a
He's written the book recently published, Reinventing Australia.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with it. What I am not comfortable with, I've just been talking about this with Mark, is the necessity for the maintenance of secrecy and of an anonymity in putting tapes in libraries. In this particular case, and if they do go into the library, they'll be 20 years after my death before anyone's going to be able to look at them, and also we aren't using names and things. I'm actually not comfortable with writing a book about unemployment today. I find, because it's so intensely personal, and since, I mean, you have people talking to you about ways to kill themselves. You know, like I don't know where to get poison, and I wouldn't fancy all that blood. And, you know, this is the sort of level of, it's so much more intensely personal than anything I've come across, that what I do with it, I'm going to have to be very careful. And of course, I go back to the people. This is my major thing. I go back to them with the piece and discuss it and ask them whether they can use it. But no, I'm sorry, so I can't really answer the question you asked, but it is a whole thing of you see, I've never made up my mind whether oral history is a valuable new tool or an intrusion into personal privacy, another electronic, you know, device. And this is, I'm not very good to talk on technology. I'm a bit of a Luddite.
Why don't you sit on the nearest chair?
Right.
We've probably got time for, say, one more question before we have to leave.
I'd like to ask Wendy to say something about her project about the left in Australian arts.
Yes. Well, it's just that I did actually think that I'm concerned about oral history and the Labour movement and the left movement and the Communist Party, because so often all these histories deal with the leaders. And I was afraid that this would happen again, and that some of the most wonderful people I've ever known are working class communists, rank and file people who have been idealistic, self-sacrificing and enormously committed. Some of my least favourite people are people who are on the Central Committee of the Communist Party. So I thought I should try and interview a communist, rank and file communist. And then I realised, of course, there were so many of us. I mean, if you knew how many there'd been in Canberra, and ones you've never heard of, and there were so many, and I realised I'm 65, you see, and so I decided I would do artists, and and the left, those, and particularly those ones who haven't been done by Hazel de Burgh, and haven't talked about that side of their artistic life with Hazel de Burgh. And I'm having a bit of trouble because so many of them, God bless them, want to be seen as bourgeois successes. And they don't particularly want to talk about, those were the good old days, Wendy. And remember who was up who and who was paying and all that stuff, They don't want to know about that. So, but I am, and I'm all, well, so I've broadened it out, Chris, and I'm actually talking to people who weren't communists as well. And one of the most fascinating discussions I had was with Niall Brennan, who was in the support of the NCC and Santa Maria, and editor, I think, of the Young Christian Worker or the Catholic Worker, such thing. And we came to the conclusion after a hilarious afternoon of shrieking and saying, "Oh, not you too," that it was exactly the same being in either organisation. We both all thought we were saving the world. We all thought that we were fighting fascism of one sort or another. We were all being told what to do by leaders who didn't know what we were talking about, and we didn't believe in culture, and except it was advance the party and raise money, and it was very interesting. So I'm finding And I'm taking a very open view. I'm asking people what they want to say, and then I'm saying, no, but you remember, Peter, when you were in your theatre and this happened and that happened. And, you know, I'm hoping for an anecdotal and honest approach rather than this is how I see my role in Australian arts stuff, you know?
Well, I'm sorry to say that's as far as we can take it today. We will have to now bring proceedings to an end. But I would just like to say one brief thing in closing, and that is that we have here two people who, between them, have got practically 50 years of direct and practical experience working with the problems that oral history has thrown up. I think it's been a great opportunity to listen to them, to learn from them, because the key questions are there, they're shared, they're mutual. And I think that also the thing that brings everybody into the room is this fascination with working not so much with documents, but with these human documents, working with people. Perhaps a round of applause.